Good afternoon again. This is John Polton, K4OZY. And as Nick mentioned, this is the part of the program where people who are obsessed with various companies get to talk. So we heard from Cosmophone, and now it's the Technical Materiel Corporation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the company's history and then very briefly about the prospect of collecting TMC equipment and operating it. Like Collins and Hallicrafters, TMC was sort of the expression of the founder of the company, in this case Ray H. de Pasquale. Ray was born in Manhattan in 1905, and he early on developed an interest in two things: selling things and amateur radio. And he turned those interests at the tender age of 25 into a corporate position at Silver Marshall, where he was the export manager for some years. In 1934, for whatever reason, he got tired of working for Silver Marshall and borrowed $300 from his dad and founded this company called Technical Products International. Within a week, he'd made enough money to pay his dad back, and he never really looked back until the war shut down his business. So with the war looming and Technical Products out of business temporarily, he went to work for a company which is forgotten but turns out to be really important in radio history, namely Press Wireless. And Ray was their VP and Director of Manufacturing from 1942 through 1947, basically the duration of the war. Immediately after the war, for reasons which I'll get into in a minute, Ray founded the Technical Materiel Corporation. And I should again mention, he was a lifelong ham, and so were most of the people who worked for him at Technical Materiel Corporation. So Press Wireless was founded in 1929 by a consortium of a bunch of newspapers, and their objective was to be able to transmit press stories around the world via wireless. And so they needed to own their own wireless network for all practical purposes. They were innovators, technical innovators in fax transmissions. They were the first to send fax photos for newspapers around the world by radio. And they also developed a teletype network very early on to make the transmission of news articles more easier. During World War II, they were a major transmitter of war news throughout the war and a major supplier of military radio equipment. By the 40s, Press Wireless was making its own transmitters and lots of other equipment. They were making fax machines and all kinds of things. During the war, they were a three-time winner of the E Award, which is a pretty big deal. Only about 4% of war manufacturers won the E Award. They won it 3 times. So the picture on the left there is Ray's group winning the E Award. The picture on the right is a Press Wireless 400-watt transmitter mounted in a truck, which was landed at Normandy Beach about just a few days after the invasion. This truck followed the troops across Europe during the war and sent back news broadcasts beginning right after the Normandy invasion. I'd really love to have that transmitter.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Is Press Wireless then something that's collectible? Is there any of the equipment hanging out there?
Every now and then you can find a piece of Press Wireless equipment, but it's commercial equipment. So if you get a receiver, it's a rack full of stuff.
Right.
I have a few little items, and Press Wireless kind of survived to a very small extent after the war as Press Wireless Manufacturing. Sometimes you see some of their stuff for sale. It's another company to get obsessed with. So this picture, which by the way has never been published, is the groundbreaking for the transmitter assembly plant in Long Island City in 1945. The two guys holding shovels, the guy on the right is Ray de Pasquale, the founder of TMC. The guy on the left is Sal Barone, who founded Northern Radio. Sal worked for Ray during the war at Press Wireless, as did a lot of other interesting technical people. So after the war, Press Wireless's press traffic fell off dramatically, as you can imagine, and also all their war contracts went away. So they found themselves in really terrible financial straits, and they ended up letting go all of their manufacturing people and most of their engineers. So after the sort of collapse of the company, Ray and two of his colleagues at Press Wireless, Bill Deans and Bill Gallione, founded what they thought was going to be a continuation of the Technical Products Company, which was a manufacturer's rep. Ray swore he would never get back into manufacturing, but that lasted maybe a year or two. So they soon realized that the profit was in making things. Also, TMC founded a Canadian subsidiary, TMC Canada, almost immediately. And I think the idea was that they could export things that without bothering with getting through the government's controls. They could also sell into the Canadian military. And Ray had a good friend who was interested in founding this twin company. The first plant location was in Mamaroneck, New York, at a place called Spencer Place, in a little building which still exists today. This is a modern photograph, called the Police Garage. And it's a little narrow building, but it's very deep. So this is where TMC made things up until 1952, when they had earned enough money to build their own headquarters at 700 Fenimore Road in Mamaroneck, which is still there today. Their early products included things like antenna terminations and matching transformers, broadband transformers, that used the new ferrite technology that had become available immediately after the war. These turned out to be products that were relatively cheap to make, but you could sell at a huge margin. So Ray was apparently famous for remarking that he never borrowed money to get TMC off the ground, but he managed to bootstrap his way up. I'm not sure that's completely true, but he certainly sold these products very well early on and raised the cash just from sales, something that you really can't do today. Another early product was a thing called the AO100. It turns out this was probably designed by a guy named Les Norda, whom some of you probably know. He was later the VP of receiver design at Hammarlund. He wasn't actually an employee at TMC, but I think he was between jobs and spent sort of a 6-month, internship or sabbatical. He was friends with Ray and ended up working at TMC over most of a summer. And during that time, he designed this little gizmo, whose pictures are on the left-hand side of the slide. It's an oven-stabilized variable frequency oscillator with linear tuning. And the linear tuning is secured by having a kind of a cam. It's a little bit like the Cosmo PTO, except it uses a capacitor as a tuning element. This thing was manufactured from 1952 well up into the 1980s, and was used in many TMC products, including the Vox, this thing on the right, which is it's the TMC version of a VFO. In 1955, Ray decided to get into the amateur radio business. And in the July QST, if you go back and look at it, you'll see this curious little ad that's up in the corner of a bunch of pages. It appears in 8 or 10 different pages in QST, and it says GPR 90. What the hell is that? Then the next month, Ray took out a 2-page ad for the GPR 90, which many of you know about. It was TMC's first effort in amateur radio. It's a dual conversion amateur radio receiver. It's general coverage. In 1955, it was introduced at $395, so less expensive than a 75A4, but it was also a lot less technically advanced. It's very much like an HQ180, if that gives you some kind of an idea. It has kind of an evil reputation, which Bob can tell you about, but it's actually a pretty decent radio. And it's also one of the most handsome amateur radio receivers ever. They work fine. They have some issues.
You just answered the question as to why there's a pipe in the ashtray, too.
Yes. So you may have noticed the picture of Ray. He was holding a pipe. He was always holding a pipe. It was his signature item. A year or so later, TMC came out with its first transmitter. This was designed by a bunch of engineers who were previous press wireless engineers, and they really knew what they were doing. This was introduced in '56, and it was designed as a replacement for the T368. So it was designed to go in, communication trailers and replace the T368, except that it was much more versatile. This is a transmitter that was 750 watts plate modulated AM, or a kilowatt on CW or RTTY, or 2 kilowatts on sideband. It would work in all of those modes. It sold very well from the get-go. I talked to Tony Fiola, whom some of us know, who actually worked on the production line for the GPT 750. I've got a picture of him fiddling around with the innards of a modulator. It's a great picture. And his remark was, well, they sold like hotcakes. We couldn't make them fast enough. So it came in several versions, including the URT-17, which was the military version, and was sold to all sorts of customers. The State Department, the FBI bought a bunch of these things, and many many of us who have them in our collection got ours from the FBI. The White House Communications Agency famously used some of these things. They were all over the place. Oh, and AT&T used the AM version for ship-to-shore phone service. Where are all those modulators? So the interesting thing about the GPT 750 is its modularity. So if you look at it, the top deck, the top of the three drawers, has a VFO, which is based on this AO100 gizmo I mentioned. It has the RF deck and RF amplification chain. The PA is a pair of 4-250s. Most of them today have 4-400s. The bottom drawer is the power supply, but it was the middle drawer where the magic happened. In the A version, the AM version, that's a plate modulator with a pair of 810s. Maybe this tube lineup sounds slightly familiar. The C version had a special exciter that TMC made called the XFK, which was for RTTY. And finally, there was a D version with a so-called SBE, sideband exciter, in the center drawer, which made it a sideband rig. So the cute trick about this thing is the power supply and final could be either run in Class C for AM or in Class AB for linear, just by throwing a switch. So TMC kind of fell in love with this modularity concept, and they carried it to really quite great lengths over the years. And so their next set of transmitter components were just that. They were modular components that were designed to go into a series of products. The first was the PAL 350, which was a 350 watt PEP amplifier that used a pair of 4CX250s. Now, if you know about 4CX250s, you're probably saying 350 watts? Really? I mean, that's not much. So the reason for this, and the reason for behind many of TMC's designs, is these are not amateur radio transmitters. These are commercial transmitters. They were designed to be plugged in and run 24/7, and they couldn't fail. They had to run reliably. So that's the reason. And a year later, the PAL 1K, the 1,000 watt version, came out. It has two power supplies because they couldn't fit it into one rack-mounted unit. And if you've ever picked up the high voltage supply of a PAL 1K, you'll realize you really don't want to put anything more in there. This uses a PL 172 final. So the modularity concept allowed TMC to introduce new products very rapidly. So for example, this is a picture of the SBT 1KA, the sideband transmitter, 1,000 watts. Over the 25-year lifespan of the SBT 1K, there were probably 30 or 40 different versions of it, and they were defined by just putting different modules in a rack, connecting them in different ways, and specializing them for different purposes. This particular one has what I would call an analog signal chain. It has an SBE sideband exciter, the Vox VFO that I mentioned earlier, and a few other odds and ends in the way of accessories. But there were dozens of different configurations. In 1959, the company produced its first high-power rig. This would be a medium-power rig if you were a Navy guy. So if you look at it, there are two racks. There's a 19-inch rack on the left and a much wider rack on the right. The left-hand rack could hold any number of components. In this case, it's configured with the same exciter that I showed you in the SBT1KA, but it has some test equipment mounted in the rack as well. On the right is a 10 kilowatt PA, but buried in the middle of it, if you look closely, is a PAL 1K. So they always viewed these transmitters as a family of transmitters that were built up modularly. The 10K was easily the most successful product that TMC ever sold, and it survived in many variations well into the 1980s. It was the Navy's main sort of medium power transmitter for many years, and it was sold to all kinds of interesting customers. If you listened to WWV from Fort Collins in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, you were listening to a GPT-10K. They had several of them, and they had a 40K as well. They still have a 10K in service as an emergency transmitter. It was also used by the Voice of America as their emergency standby low-power transmitter, and there were many other customers. In the next year or so, the company produced even higher power transmitters. If you look at the 40K, the 40 kilowatt transmitter on the left, you'll recognize that there's a 10K in the left-hand two racks. The right-hand two racks hold a 40K power amplifier. So the GPT-10K became the IPA for this transmitter. And finally, there's the GPT-200K, a real beast. So it has a 40K on the left of the dividing plane where all the air conditioning plenums come in, and on the right is a 40K power amplifier. So the 40K was the IPA, I guess.
These are ground to grid amplifiers.
Oh yes, yeah. And I believe the tubes were from Macleth, at least originally. So back to some company history. After a decade of amazing growth, the company went public. It was listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1959, a year in which their sales totaled $5 million, which doesn't sound like much today, but was not bad. The sales for this company peaked in 1964 at about $30 million and kind of went downhill after that. It was a medium-sized company. But nevertheless, they quickly outgrew their plants. And in 1960, the company built a plant on Waverly Avenue in Mamaroneck, just a few blocks from Fenimore Road, where they were building receivers and various kinds of systems. In 1961, they built a plant in West Nyack, New York. It's across the Tappan Zee Bridge from Mamaroneck, right on the New York Thruway. And if you drive on the Thruway today, you'll see it's still there, and it's housing an electrical installation company. The reason this plant was built, I heard this sort of story. So apparently they built a few 200Ks in Mamaroneck. But when you tested a 200K, the lights in Mamaroneck basically all dimmed. And the housewives got tired of this, so they needed a place that had more reliable electrical power, and that was West Nyack.
Why did they not have facilities in Canada?
Oh, they did have facilities in Canada. The Canadian company, TMC Canada, mostly worked on smaller items and portable systems. And that was the market they had. They sold a lot of stuff to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Air Force.
Really two different companies.
It was two different companies, although they shared the tradition of quality, certainly. And eventually TMC built sites all over the place. In addition to TMC Canada, there was a facility at San Luis Obispo in California, and a site in Arizona that made crystal filters. The TMC research group, which I'll tell you about in a minute, was located in California. Ray also bought a company called that built uninterruptible power systems and formed TMC Power Systems in Alexandria, Virginia. That was a completely different company. It was apparently way ahead of its time. It was building these diesel generator flywheel-driven uninterruptible power sources, and evidently never made any money. No discussion of TMC would be complete without at least mentioning some of the special projects the company did. This one, there's way too much information about this to go into, but I'll just briefly give you a teaser. This is Project Jenny. TMC was the prime contractor to build what amounted to a flying broadcast transmitter. So these planes, these beautiful aircraft, were fitted with the one on the left, which was Blue Eagle 1, was fitted with a diesel generator, a GPT-10K, and a bunch of other radio equipment, and could broadcast while flying around. The Blue Eagles 2, 3, and 4 were TV aircraft equipped mostly with RCA equipment. And you can see I have a shot of the interior of the plane, which should give you some idea of how crowded it was. And maybe you can imagine how noisy it was. So there was a diesel generator running in the back of the plane. All this equipment was running with all of its fans. But even so, there was a little tiny studio in the front of the plane where you could actually broadcast live. These planes were deployed to Vietnam, where they were flown by the Blue Eagle Squadron, very bravely, I might add. These planes were a tad on the overweight side. They were interesting to fly, apparently. And they did the first airborne TV broadcast of a World Series game. You should visit my website or the Blue Eagle website. It's really quite interesting. Other projects included portable communication systems for the military. The first one, I believe, was Project Baker, which was an MSC-42. It was a a portable communication system built in transportable vans. And over on the left, you can see the MSC-42 getting assembled at the Waverly Avenue plant. This photograph is worth looking at because they're all kind of cool cars parked in the parking lot. You can tell exactly what year it was. On the right is a much grander project. This was the TSC-35. It comprised a transmitter site and a separate receiver site and a separate spook site for encoding and decoding messages. It was located, only one was built and was located at Nia Makri in Greece. This was Project Judy as far as TMC was concerned. It was mostly performed at Alexandria. Nick England back here has all kinds of information about Project Judy on his website. It's pretty entertaining. In the mid-50s, the Navy needed some new functions that didn't exist before. First was remote control. They wanted to be able to put receivers and transmitters far apart so that they could avoid interaction. And they wanted to put receivers far from noise sources. So often they needed receivers, transmitters, and a control center that was in yet a third place. They also needed much more precise frequency control. You'll be hearing about this from Nick in a few minutes, to support ever narrowband, higher bandwidth radio teletype communication. So TMC was an innovator in both areas. They introduced the FR502, a fixed frequency receiver, which was controllable remotely in the mid-50s. This was controllable by sending audio tones over a telephone line. The audio tones were decoded at the far end and allowed you to do some sort of minimal tuning of these receivers. In 1960, they introduced this idea of technomatic control. This was actually digital control, digital remote control of receivers using sort of teletype level bit transmission. The first synthesized sideband exciter for more precise frequency control was introduced in 1958, and they introduced the synthesized controlled DDR5 receiver for the Navy in 1962. Synthesized transmitters included first were supported by a synthesizer that TMC called the SBG. This was introduced in 1958, and I believe TMC may have built the first synthesized sideband transmitters ever. There were a couple of companies making synthesizers, but I think TMC was the first company to integrate that into a complete transmitting system. So the SBG itself, it's a full rack of stuff to make an exciter, and then that was bolted onto a 10K to make a synthesized 10K.
So was that, I take it, all tube type synthesizer?
Almost. It was almost all tubes except for a countdown chain which was built with transistors.
I wonder when the URC-32, how long was built? Was that synthesized?
Do you know the date for the URC-32? Yeah, I think it was later. This is 1958. Synthesizers were unheard of. And as I mentioned, the synthesized receivers included the DDR5. The company made hundreds and hundreds of these monsters, and in dozens of different variations. The variations are so complicated, I had to build a whole website to figure it out. They were available in all kinds of different functions for diversity, multiple independent sideband reception, and remote control. A really huge one of these things, 5 racks wide, was sold to the space program to support alternate communication during the Apollo program. Here's remote control. This is the company at the control panel for the remote control panel 5, and you can see the DDR5 remote control receiver in the background. The interface uses could use paper tape or manual control. In 1963, the company finally went solid state. This transition wasn't easy for TMC. Most of the engineers at TMC had grown up during the war and were sort of firmly stuck in the tube era. But TMC was fortunate to have hired a bunch of engineers from the University of Montana, and that was the nucleus of a group called TMC Research, which, as I mentioned, was first located in California, later in Arizona. They built the prototypes of all of TMC's major transistorized equipment. And then they would send the prototypes to Mamaroneck, where the engineers at Mamaroneck would turn it into a product and figure out how to manufacture it. This TTR-10 was a completely workable transceiver, introduced in 1963, but it didn't sell very well. However, our good friend Alan Duddles, who worked for the company at the time and was a field engineer, was given the task of, he had some idle time, why don't you take these TTR-10 modules and build them into a 1U tall exciter or receiver, which he did. And these strip receivers and strip exciters, the STR and STEs, actually sold extremely well. There were hundreds of them in service around, particularly in Canada, at airports. And along with the PAL 350, the small amplifier, it made a really tidy transmitter package. You even see these things at Hamfest every now and then. In 1968, the company introduced what might have been a bit of overreach. Yeah, Bob is nodding over here. This is the MMX solid-state exciter, and it was sort of the company's flagship product in 1968. It was an amazing piece of engineering. I mean, it was very compact and very versatile. It could do all modes. It was completely synthesized. It had 1 hertz resolution. It was an amazing item. A little too amazing, as it turned out. It wasn't terribly reliable. You probably can't see this cartoon, but the cartoon was drawn at the Voice of America, which tried to use MMXs. But I think the MMXs spent more time on Federal Express than they did at VOA. By the late 60s, TMC was kind of going downhill. The 60s and 70s weren't very nice to the company. For one thing, the Navy was winding down from Vietnam and also sort of moving away from HF communication, and they needed a new generation of communication gear. And TMC wasn't really able to find a new customer to take the Navy's place. They also, as you could see, had some difficulty producing reliable solid-state gear. And unfortunately, thanks to a really bad business decision on the part of Ray, they managed to lose their excellent design team at TMC Research. They were offered the opportunity of moving from Arizona to Mamaroneck, New York, and they politely declined. And the company also had to put up with a strike in the mid-70s. They also had made many attempts to enter new markets, which produced some amusing results, which are on my website. None successful. And finally, there was the DDR-10 disaster. So the DDR-10 was intended to replace the DDR-5. It was an all-solid-state design. It was a response to a very ambitious Navy RFP. It needed very high stability, very low noise, and remote tuning. TMC decided to develop this receiver at their own expense, and the development took nearly 4 years instead of the 2 they had planned, by which time the receiver was already obsolete. It's an excellent receiver, but it was just too late for its time, so the Navy only ended up ordering a few dozen of these things. The effort caused TMC to lose many millions of dollars when the company was only worth a few $1 million. So it was a disaster. It's really quite amazing. Even though only a couple dozen of these DDR-10s were made, quite a few of them survive, and most of them are at John Vendley's house down in Florida.
You said in an earlier slide, 1 year they sold $25 million worth.
That was in 1964.
Okay, well, you would think that they would have greater, deeper pockets than
their business had been falling off, and I think they spent most of what was in their pockets on this development. The company kind of hung on until into the 90s. It was delisted from the stock exchange in 1971. And by the early 80s, the company had closed all of its remote offices and had contracted to just 700 Fenimore Road. They did some temporary business in the early 80s refurbishing these GPT-10Ks. The Navy turned out they were getting replacement transmitters from Harris, I believe. Harris couldn't deliver as fast as they thought, so the Navy actually had to go out on the surplus market, buy these transmitters back, and then have TMC refurbish them. So that kept the company going for a few years. In the 90s, the company continued to build things like antenna couplers and antenna products, and they kind of hung on at a very small size. And unfortunately, Ray died in 1994, leaving his son Neil to close down the company. So with that in mind, let me turn briefly to TMC collecting. So if you're at a Hamfest and you look across the Hamfest and you see this really intriguing gray thing over there, it's all laid out kind of formally and symmetrically, and as you get closer, you realize it's really well made. That's what gets you going on TMC collecting. They're all painted gray except for the NASA things, which are painted a bilious green color. God knows why. They usually have etched lettering. They use absolutely top quality components, and they're really very, very well made. The gear isn't easy to find, but it's out there, and we'll return to that in a moment. So you often see GPR 90s and sometimes their companion GSB1 sideband adapter. You even see them at Hamfest. And today you can get a pretty decent one for $300-400. The GPR 90 was made in several variants, and the tall variants, the ones that have this extra panel on the top which holds a crystal oscillator, are actually pretty collectible. They weren't very common, and they can go up for upwards of $1,000 for a decent one. And then there's the GPR 92, which was developed at TMC in, I think, 1963 as a replacement for the GPR 90. These are quite rare and extremely collectible, even though it's not a terribly good radio. It does have a product detector, so it's sort of a, quote, modern radio. TMC made a series of sideband adapters, which they called the MSR, and it was available in MSR 2 through MSR 9. They had various kinds of modifications. These are excellent performers, and if you have an R390A and you want to receive sideband, this is the perfect companion for your R390A. They were available in many variations I mentioned, and including quite a few military designations. They're quite collectible. A good one will go for $700 on eBay, but they're worth having. They're pretty nice. Suppose I could convince you that you might want to build a TMC transmitter. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you need to collect the components, because as you may remember, these are modular transmitters. So you'll need a Vox or its lightweight version, the PMO. You'll need an SBE or something equivalent. The SBE, if you find one, make sure you get the power supply and the cable. The thing is useless without the power supply. Or if you're very lucky, you might find a GPE1, which is it's basically an AM QRP rig. It's the AM exciter. And then you can add an amplifier, like a PAL 350 or PAL 500. The PAL 500 is just a PAL 350 with newer alpha tubes. This amplifier also is almost useless without its power supply. Now, you might think you could build a power supply, but it turns out TMC really knew how to build a power supply, and getting it to be an exact replacement would be quite a project. But the main thing, if you get one of these small amps, is to be sure to get the cable with it. The cable is damn near impossible to reproduce. The PAL 1Ks are actually slightly more common, but again, they often show up without their power supplies. Cables aren't a big problem with the PAL 1K because the cable, they finally learn, and the cable is firmly attached to the PA. These use PL172 PA tubes, which are a little bit of a problem, but they can be had. Or you can get an entire transmitter. A GPT 750 is a dandy transmitter. In particular, the sideband version is quite desirable, although not very common. But you could easily add an external SBE exciter. The AM version is unbelievably scarce. The only modulator I've ever seen is in my shack. So, good ones of these go from $800 to $1,500. To get it going, you're going to have to make up for 60 years of deferred maintenance, which is going to require a bit of skill, but it can be done. And once you have it done, you have a really great transmitter. It's really reliable. Think of it as kind of a KW1 with none of the quirks. Yeah. So fortunately, if you want to collect TMC equipment, there are lots of resources, and mainly on the website that I maintain. I'm kind of the keeper of this website, but mostly it's due to the kindness of Neil DePasquale, who's the son of the company founder. He put in my charge all of the company's manuals, all of the drawings that the company used to produce its equipment, all of the photographs they took over the years, all of the technical literature. It's all there, and much of it is scanned and on this website. You're welcome to email me at any time. I know a lot of TMC collectors. I know where there's a lot of equipment for sale. And you can also subscribe to the TMC mail list. Thanks. Any questions?
You can make a antenna tuner with a ring couple on it.
Thinking about that. They made a lot of antenna tuners. There's the ATS-1 has that beautiful cross needle VSWR meter, which some of you probably have seen, and it had a remote motor operated tuner out by the antenna. I don't think it's link couple. I think it's a conventional tuner. There's a thing whose designation I can't think of. It's like a BC969. It's for driving a whip. Remember the GPD 750 was supposed to go in a trailer, so I can't think of any. There were some interesting products developed for Project Jenny, though, trailing wire antennas. Anything else?
John, maybe your memory's better than mine. I emailed you about the TMC solid state synthesized receiver I've got that doesn't work. It came way at the end. I was just wondering, how does
Oh, you're the person with the GPR 110.
110, that's it.
Yes, I should.
So where did that fit in with respect to, say, the DDR10?
So the GPR 110 was developed after the DDR10. So at this point you could get a great tabletop receiver from various sources. So they were trying to compete. So they built this GPR 110. It was a disaster.
Done by then.
They sold a bunch of them to the Egyptian government, and then they had to buy them back. So that was bad.
I can attest to the fact that it doesn't work very well.
Neil says it doesn't work very well and never will. So, but however, if you're interested in selling it, let me know. Thanks.